Few events rival the crowning of a new British monarch, observed across the Commonwealth, but especially in London, where the ceremonies take place, the pomp, the ritual, and of course, the crowds lay claim to the significance of the moment. Novelist Jennifer Robson's new book of historical fiction, Coronation Year, is set against the backdrop of Queen Elizabeth's accession to the throne in 1953. It also gives her a fascinating perspective on the coronation of King Charles. And Jennifer Robson joins us now. Welcome back.
Thank you so much.
I really enjoy the book.
Thank you.
I have a slight confession.
Okay.
I got stressed at one point and I had to look to the back to see if everything worked out the way I wanted it to.
Yeah.
But we are going to talk about the book in a few moments, but big weekend. King Charles was crowned the king. What were your thoughts on what happened this past weekend?
Oh, I have so many thoughts. I'm still feeling a little shaky after getting up so early. I mean, I think I was up at 3 a.m. to watch with the same group of friends. We watched these royal occasions together. And, I was struck yet again by the historic nature of it. How could I not be a history nerd to my core?
You're a social historian.
Yes, and watching something, the key elements that we saw on Saturday were elements that the precise wording may have changed, but the order in which they occur within the coronation, these central elements of, the recognition, the oath, the anointing, and so on, they're more or less unchanged for 1,050 years. If we look at the first acknowledged coronation of an English king being that of King Edgar in the late 900s, I mean, that kind of blows my mind. That something that's so ancient that practically nothing of that world remains today, apart from, the genetic descendants of the people who are alive, for presumably many are still alive on this globe. But the idea that something so ancient has endured is really fascinating to me. And it's not an unexamined interest, or in the sense that, I have concerns, as I think anybody who sits down and thinks about it for more than a few minutes, about the idea of one family of white people who have inherited this role, they get to maintain this position without, anything. They're not elected into the role, and does that reflect the true nature of Britain, its diversity today, and in fact of Canada? Those are things I really think about a lot and wonder, am I just accepting this in an unquestioning way? And what is the role of sentiment in my reaction to all of this? And I certainly did feel very sentimental and somewhat emotional at moments, when the crown was placed on the king's head.
You're bringing up a lot of points I want to follow up, but why were you emotional?
I think for me, and this happened certainly when the Queen passed away as well, a lot of my feelings, the more I examined them, I thought were probably caught up in feelings associated with childhood, the loss of childhood, the loss of people dear to me. In my mind, I have my late grandmother, my late mother, and somehow the Queen was not really a stand-in. I never saw her in person even, but she was this maternal figure, as it were, who I felt as if I knew. I didn't really know her. None of us knew her, but she was there. She was a very reassuring presence, and that brings up all sorts of feelings that may be true emotions. It may be sentimentality. That's something I spend a lot of time kind of trying to parse. What is real and what is a manufactured emotion. But I did feel, as I was watching the ceremony at the crack of dawn on Saturday, I did feel my heartstrings being plucked, and moments where the Prince of Wales knelt before his father and swore his fealty to him, which is, fealty, if that isn't an ancient term, I'm not sure what is. Those really resonated with me.
It's so interesting what you said, because I think we can see that happening in the discourse. in the book that we're going to talk about, there wasn't social media.
Yeah.
Now on social media, we're kind of having these conversations in real time.
Yeah.
You mentioned something about your concerns. You know, this is happening within a family, but this is happening against the backdrop. The UK is going through some very difficult times. I think the BBC reported that the coronation cost anywhere between $50 to $100 million. They haven't released the exact figure, but there's a cost of living crisis. People are they're struggling having food. There were protests during the coronation, and people were arrested, and some people were saying, you know, why, this is my free speech, why can't I protest? So how do you balance those? How do you balance those two things in celebrating the coronation of the king against the backdrop of the reality that a lot of people in the UK are living through right now?
I think it's a really, really difficult path to tread. And I think it's one, in all fairness, and I feel a lot of people have a knee-jerk reaction to the king, that they just are bound and determined to dislike him, and are not really willing to kind of set the past aside to any degree, and let him do his best. So again, that's sentiment kind of leading me to a certain degree. I think the king is certainly very mindful of this. Not to be an apologist for him, but I think he was running the show effectively, and there was an effort to trim the costs, and things that might seem insignificant, like trimming the length of the route, were done really only because that was a significant way to bring down costs, because there are fewer security personnel needed to watch the route. But at the same time, I mean, it's a very real and pressing concern that people are having a really hard time of things in Britain, and I would argue in other countries in the Commonwealth as well. And to spend so much money on what is, what you could fairly say is a relic of the past, is always going to be a contentious issue. And I found myself torn as I was watching, between being absolutely humbled and awestruck by the beauty of the surroundings, the music, the ceremony itself, and I was also struck by, I think there was a sincere effort. Did it go far enough? I'm not sure, but I think there was a sincere effort to include people from all backgrounds, ethnicities, faiths in the service. If you compare it to 1953, and I've watched the film of the Queen's coronation so many times, I feel it's burned into my brain. That coronation was a profoundly white gathering. There are only a handful of people who were not white. They would have been monarchs from other countries, such as the Queen of Tonga, who was so famously popular because she kept the top of her carriage down even though it was raining, so that she could wave to the crowds and they could wave to her. She was hugely popular in London that day and afterwards. But she's one. There's maybe a half a dozen people there, which is just, you look at it now, and I think what strikes me looking at the audience in the 1953 coronation is there's something wrong, there's something missing. And that's because Britain was a diverse nation then, it just wasn't acknowledged.
Well, you drew a great picture of the coronation in the book, which we're going to get to in a few moments. But you mentioned Prince William. The other son, Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, was there.
Yeah.
He was wearing something called a morning suit. He was sitting in the third row. And one commentator on Twitter was saying, his face was obscured by Princess Anne's feather.
Yes.
He didn't do any interviews, and he didn't participate in any of the coronation activities. What did you think of his role or lack of it?
I thought it was, it must have been heartbreaking for everyone involved. As much as it's easy to kind of, none of us really know what is going on in the heart of the family. And I did think it was rather shabby that Prince Andrew, who really is beneath contempt, was wearing his garter robes, and Prince Harry, who is entitled to wear not garter robes. It's the Royal Victorian Order, I think. His
Very
robes.
ornate.
Yeah, he, either they, I feel as if Prince Harry really, again, should have been accorded some degree of respect in that sense. When I think of it, I keep going back to the thoughts of my sister, who is a psychotherapist, and she's the person I turn to whenever I want to understand how people tick. She's very helpful when I'm writing my books and trying to figure out what motivates people. And her take on this, which she related to me, was that, again, this is a family. If you take away the role they occupy, if you take away the billions of dollars worth of jewels and the magnificent surroundings, they're people like anyone else. And I feel a real sense of sympathy to everyone involved. I mean, I think, gosh, I've had disagreements with my kids, and nothing quite on the order of what's separating the king and Prince Harry, but if all of those were to become public fodder, if people were to know and comment upon that, I think that would not only be mortifying, but it would also make it extraordinarily difficult to have any kind of reconciliation. So that, to me, was a real moment of sadness in watching the coronation. And I'm not sure, however, what they could have done otherwise that would have satisfied everyone. It's just they're in a bit of a pickle right now.
I have so many questions about the coronation. I'm going to ask you one more, and because I really want to have time for us to talk about the book. A lot of this hedges on the popularity, right? This past weekend, the Prime Minister confirmed that the King will be on the $20 bills and some coins. There was a poll that said that only an average of just 38% of those polled would want to see the King on our money, and that was an Angus Reid poll. Over in the UK, we know that the monarchy has always been more popular amongst older generations than younger ones, but there was a poll by YouGov, a polling firm in the United Kingdom. It showed 75% of respondents between the ages of 18 and 24 said they cared very little or not at all about the coronation. And another YouGov poll found that 78% of young people weren't interested in the royal family whatsoever. What do you see as the future of the monarch family?
See that,
the British monarchy.
Again, that is one I've been spending a lot of time thinking about. The question is, setting aside issues of how popular they are or not, is the difficulty is if there is no royal family and, say, a republic is enacted in both the UK and Canada, then who then becomes the head of state? And how do we reorder our government so that it is as stable as possible? I think you see in other countries where the head of state is not only elected but is kind of in the thick of things politically. That can lead to real instability. I think looking at the United States at the moment, that there's an example. As much as they may not be popular, they do occupy a role that is quite stabilizing for our system of government and for the UK system of government. And it's not that I personally would be opposed necessarily to having a system of government that doesn't include a non-elected, inherited, head of state that has inherited the position not through any of their personal actions. It's just devolved to them. But then my concern is, what do we have instead? And what do we have that preserves the stability that I think a lot we may not think about day to day, but it does afford us, a sense of, again, stability, of continuity that we enjoy without necessarily reflecting on how important it is to us as a country.
Well, let's talk about the book. We have a few more minutes left. Wonderful cover, very,
love the cover.
Just draws you in. One of my favorite characters, probably my favorite character, has the same name as my grandfather, Alexander James.
I think that's amazing.
Which is really cool. Can you give us a synopsis of what the book is about?
So the book, the main setting, which is almost a character unto itself, is the Blue Lion Hotel, which dates to the 1560. And has kind of weathered the centuries as a hotel, has somehow managed to stay open. And it's now run in 1953 by a young woman called Edie Howard, who is the last of her family, the last of the Howards. And she's barely managing to keep the place open. And then by, just the stroke of a bureaucrat's pen, the coronation procession is announced, and it goes straight past her hotel, which will allow her to, charge a premium so that people can... Life-changing moment for her. And so we're following Edie as she prepares for this big moment for the Blue Lion. And two other characters are central to the book. The first is a young woman called Stella Donati, who is a survivor of the Holocaust, Italian, as you might guess from her name. And she's come to England to start anew. And she's working as a staff photographer for a weekly news magazine called Picture Weekly, which would be not unlike Life magazine in the United States or Picture Post in the UK. And then the third character is Alexander James Geddes, who is an artist who's been commissioned to paint a portrait of the Queen on Coronation Day as she rides past in her Gold State coach. And so he's come to the hotel. It's a handy place for him to stay while he's preparing for the big day, doing his preparatory drawings. And so the three of them are drawn together and become friends. And then, overlaying all of this, there are some malevolent actions by a mysterious actor who is determined to destroy, Coronation Day and possibly the hotel and the people who live in it as well.
I loved the relationships between the characters and how the way that you wrote them, there was little surprises here and there. But I also loved how much history was in this book. A few details in the book surprised me, like the fact that at the time of Queen Elizabeth's coronation, there was still rations of ingredients like butter. Why was that the case?
So Britain, if you imagine in 1945, at the end of World War II, the treasury was almost, you could say, literally empty. There was just nothing left. Britain as a nation had been beggared by the war. And in order to kind of rebuild the economy, what had been wartime privations, such as rationing and then austerity measures, continued after the war. They continued through 1947 when the Queen Princess Elizabeth was married, and that's the backdrop to one of my previous books, The Gown. And even into 1953, a lot of the rationing had been lifted, but things like butter and sugar were still under the ration, sweets as well. Now, the rationing was lifted later in the year, but in the period that encompasses the book, the first 6 months of 1953. I mean, so you think of it, people who are trying to bake cakes for Coronation Day had to, they had to perform wonders. A lot of the time it would be a kind of, sharing with neighbors in the spirit that got people through the war, but it had to endure after the war as well.
There's a lot of community in the book. You also mentioned that the female guests to the coronation were not allowed to wear hats, but could or should wear veils pinned to the backs of their heads.
Just ridiculous.
What was that about?
It was called a light veiling. It was interesting as I think they actually, with this coronation, they managed to get the dress code just right in terms of people being comfortable and not having to wear ridiculous things. But for the 1953 coronation, women were supposed to wear gowns that went to the ground, even though it happened in the late morning. And the idea was, well, if one had a tiara, one would wear the tiara. But if not, which would be most people, you could have this light veiling pinned to the back of your head with maybe a few feathers or something. Maybe a predecessor of the modern fascinators that women often wear.
Well, something that you mentioned in the book, it was just like a small paragraph, but it stood out for me because you wrote about the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953 and the desire for people to be there in person, even though it was being televised, it was broadcasted on television. And the same applied this past weekend. The weather was terrible. I know I lived in the UK for 5 years, and the weather, you have like a week of summer, but a lot of people came out.
I would have been surprised if it hadn't been terrible, right? I just, that's my overall memories of living in England, just as you did, is just rain, a lot of rain.
So why do you think that people want to be there in person instead of just watching it on
I
television?
think it's for that feeling of being able to say to your grandchildren, I was there. I got to watch, in this case, the king and queen go by in the gold state coach. The coach, which I've made no bones about it, I think is absolutely hideous, and is notoriously uncomfortable. I mean, I feel the king and queen probably had to have like a Dramamine or something before they got in. But it's that feeling of participating, of being a part of things. And it was again very moving to see how many people stayed out in the rain and wanted to have that moment. And that in itself is a form of community building, I think.
You have a PhD in British economic and social history from Oxford. Why did you start writing novels instead of going into academia?
To be the blunt answer is that I couldn't get a job. History departments around the world have been steadily diminishing, getting smaller and smaller for years. History is just a less popular major for students at university, which I think is unfortunate, but that's there's nothing I can do to fix that, except possibly write books that make people interested in history. Before I started writing, this year will mark the 10th year since my first book came out. I was working as an editor, and I was a freelancer at home with my kids, and I felt that my wheels are spinning a little bit, and I really wanted my children to look to me as someone that they felt proud of. And not in because I was famous or anything, which I'm not. But I wanted them to be proud of me because they saw in me someone who was doing work that she loved. That was especially important for my daughter. I really needed her to see that work is important to women, that work that you find meaningful is very important. And that's why I started to try to write my first book. And I'm as surprised as anyone else that I'm sitting here, and very grateful, to be honest.
No, you were extremely talented. I read something, you lost your mom when she was 21.
So I was 21.
You were 21. You were
and she was 51, 2 years younger than I am now.
And part of it was you wanted, because that relationship was strong, but you wanted that for your own kids.
Yeah.
Why would you say you'd want to write this book now?
So a lot of people have been under the impression that I wrote the book since the Queen passed away, which would be quite the feat, since that it takes a solid year or two in publishing to kind of get a book from the drawing board into bookstores. I had written it originally because I was interested, just as I was when I wrote The Gown. I wanted to know what life was like for ordinary people in 1947, in that very bleak, gray period after the end of the war, when it seemed like nothing would ever get better. By contrast, by 1953, yes, there's still some rationing in place and some austerity measures economically, but by and large, the prevailing mood was one of hope. And then the accession of the Queen, this young, beautiful woman, who just seemed, we think of her often, as a very elderly lady, but the Queen of 1953 was a figure of real glamour, and people looked to her as a symbol of this coming age of prosperity, of success for Britain. They referred to her reign as a new Elizabethan age, and so I wanted to capture that feeling of optimism after the war, but also put it in relationship to how things really were, which is to say things were really still quite tough for a lot of people. And to draw a portrait of what life was like then, not for the royal family. We know plenty about the royal family, but for ordinary people who could have been my grandparents, could have been your grandfather, your Scottish grandfather. What was life like for them? That's at the heart of all of my books.
You did a terrific job. It's an excellent book, and I learned so much history that I didn't know by reading this book. Congratulations.
Thank you.
We thank you so much for coming in to speak to us about this and the coronation. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.